honest and not letting dollars get lost to smaller and more, I guess, shunned away from causes.
Can you give me like maybe an example? Like, you know, I know when we were giving money to the UCLA AIDS Institute, you know, we wanted the money to go directly to the UCLA AIDS Institute, but UCLA imposes a tax on the AIDS Institute for their research. And that's a case where, you know, I want to know what is that tax, and you know, is the organizational capacity of UCLA important vis-a-vis the organizational capacity of the AIDS Institute? So in that kind of a specific example, I might tend to agree with you. But the question is, it's used now, you know, for the average donor. I just see it with, I was at a meeting at Oxfam America this past summer, and they were looking at a multi-day event, and they had a directive from their board that if they could not show a 65% return in the budget and be sure of it in year one, they couldn't do the event. You know, so you might leave 62 cents in incremental funding. That might be $1 million or $2 million a year on the table for multiple years in a row, simply because it isn't meeting that threshold. I don't see how that's helping the cause, you know. So I might tend to agree with you that there are some examples for a sophisticated donor where it might have an impact, but I disagree with the average lay person who's not using that in any kind of a sophisticated way.
So I guess, like, so when you remove this question from the equation, you know, if you really can get this groundswell up and get people to stop asking what, you know, how much of my money is going to the cause, how do you, I guess, combat the forces that can get people to take advantage of that, I guess, to take advantage of that lack of oversight?
Well, I think people can take advantage of it even in the face of this cause. You know, I don't think there's any nexus between fraud and high overhead. The Supreme Court has written about that on a couple of different occasions, and I don't think we should be building an entire evaluative system around something that around weeding out fraud. I mean, that should be the role of law enforcement and not, you know, a ubiquitous evaluative measure. The other thing, you know, about that question, even to a sophisticated audience, is nonprofit organizations, because they know they live or die by how high or low their overhead is, as I sort of hinted at here, they game the system and they change the definition of the cause. Now, as I said, I believe in a liberal definition of the cause, a very liberal definition of the cause, but I don't when there's no standard, and one organization has a liberal definition of the cause and the other has a conservative, that you've lost all basis for comparison, and you can make really bad judgments labeling the good charity bad and the bad charity good. And this nonprofit overhead cost study, in their examination of those 120,000 Form 990s, found that 1/3 of the nonprofit organizations with revenues of $5 million or more were reporting zero fundraising costs. Now, I don't know how you raise $5 million with zero fundraising costs. What they were doing is just taking that fundraising cost and saying, that's program, you know. We saw this with our own events where we had a historical average with everything thrown in. You know, the events we had to cancel, the ones that didn't perform well, of 55% return to the cause, 45% spent on, you know, logistics and advertising and all of that. Well, the people who followed in our footsteps did worse than that. But what they did is they took half of their event costs and allocated them to programs, so it looked like they had 75% returns on the dollar. And I think that you start to get into a serious question of ethics when you know your donor thinks the cause is medical research, and you're not being transparent with them, and know what it really means is medical research and advertising and some administrative costs, etc. So that's a big area where that question really falls apart. Another thing that I didn't want to bring up because it's a little technical, but there's the difference between an increment and an average. So while an organization's average return might be, say, 60%, the return for you as a new donor at some point in the year when that organization has covered all of its expenses is 100%. Whether or not you give $1 to that charity has a $1 impact on programs because their overhead is covered. So it's a huge inaccuracy to say to you that only 60% of your donation is going to the cause. It's not true. 100% of your incremental action is impacting the cause. And there are certain academicians who've written a lot about that, and they feel that's the most important reason to stop using that as a measure, because the average disincentivizes the donor whose incremental effect might be much larger than the average. Yeah.
My question is, I agree with a lot of things you say, especially those 5 areas where the rule books discriminate against nonprofits, but in light of the economic crisis where the for-profit rule book allowed companies like the auto industry and the financial banking industry to take so much risk that they then failed, isn't it something to say that like the rule book for the nonprofit is so risk averse that they're going to be around forever? Isn't there something to say about like that, the stability in the nonprofit industry?
I don't want stability. I want the end of breast cancer. I don't want that to be around forever, you know? And sorry to jump on you like that, but I think we're so far away from having to worry about the American Cancer Society taking the kind of risk that AIG took. You know, there's so much gray area in there, and I find that that people, not you, but that people will use any excuse to keep the nonprofit sector exactly where it is. Like yesterday, someone said, "Well, you know, we live in these new economic times where capitalism is dead, and we need a new system." And whoa. Capitalism is dead, really. I mean, I drove over here in a Pontiac, I went to Whole Foods a little earlier, I'm showing you this on a Mac, I'm wearing a pair of shoes that were made in, you know, if capitalism is dead, I don't see the evidence of it. You know, yeah, we've got some serious problems, some ethical problems in a variety of industries and at the uppermost levels, but capitalism has hardly been abandoned, and to use that as an excuse to keep discriminating against the nonprofit sector would be a shame. Yes.
A lot of it seems like it's become institutionalized to look at nonprofit that way. So how, I don't know if you suggest this in your book, but how do you suggest going about building that climate of trust with the donors who are programmed to think that if it's not going to the cause, then it's going to something either unnecessary or possibly fraudulent? And with all, you know, around holidays, like that guy said, everyone's always talking about how people are just coming out of the woodwork to take your money so that you think that you're giving to charity. Like, how do you go about establishing more, you know, of a trusting climate for donors?
Well, first, I think it's hardly the kind of problem we have to worry about. I mean, people are generally smart, and, you know, somebody calls you up and says, "Hey, do you want to give $50 to Katrina? I'm calling from the Katrina Relief Fund." You know, you might go, let me think about that for a minute. You know, and you have other causes that you're interested in, and where you study things a little bit better. But how to build trust, it's a problem. Paul Light at NYU does a study every year on this, and last year he found that 79% of the donating public thinks charities waste either a great deal or a fair amount of money. But there's no study out there that shows that charities actually do waste money. So where is this coming from? Well, it's like, you know, if I say don't think of a polka-dotted elephant right now, it's exactly what you think of. When the dominant word is overhead, whether it's keep overhead low or this charity has low overhead or high overhead, all we think about is overhead, and overhead sort of means waste. So I think we need to meet the public where they're at, and I think we ought to invest, you know, $1 billion or $1.5 billion a year, half of 1% of annual giving, in some kind of a magnificent apparatus that can go out to a local, you know, to say Path Partner